We have a great panel today to discuss blockchain technology and legal issues. So let's get started. First, we have Alex Jacome, Achevion's Chief Executive Officer, who has over 10 years of experience building top-notch software products. His contagious passion for elegant solutions drives the entire team to achieve perfection. Peter Rogers is Achevion's blockchain practice lead. He's a highly accomplished high-tech executive with a distinguished 20-year career growing revenue, profits, and market share for both established and early-stage companies. Peter is now passionate about and fully focused on the fast-growing market for blockchain applications and solutions. Linda McReynolds is of counsel at McReynolds & Donahue, practicing primarily in the areas of telecommunications and privacy law. Ms. McReynolds is a certified information privacy professional, CIPP US. She counsels clients on issues arising under the Telecommunications Act and federal and state laws addressing privacy and data security. And we have Ron Quirk, who's head of McReynolds & Donahue's Internet of Things and Connected Devices practice group. Mr. Quirk's career spans more than 20 years, including several years at AmLaw 100 firms and the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. He focuses his practice on a variety of legal and regulatory matters that are of particular importance to Internet of Things businesses seeking to solidify and expand their markets. You have them all up there in front of you. And we are now going to talk about the goals for this presentation. First, you're going to hear about blockchain. It's a disruptive technology with wide range applications. Second, how can blockchain make an impact in your industry? All right. Third, what are the legal implications and challenges presented by blockchain technology? And we're taking questions during this presentation. You can submit your questions using the toolbar on the right side of your screen, or you can email ais@comlawgroup.com. We seem to have a bit of a delay with the presentation on your screen, but that email address will show up hopefully momentarily. There it is. Now let's get started with Achevion Solutions, and we have Peter to start us off.
Oh, hi everybody, and thanks for inviting us here today. I'm looking forward to talking about blockchain, but before I start talking about blockchain, I'm going to take a minute or two to talk about Bitcoin. I'm sure everybody has heard of Bitcoin, I'm sure, and probably a large number of people actually hold Bitcoin. And perhaps a few of you out there have actually used Bitcoin to make a transaction. And it's worth noting that if you have used Bitcoin for a transaction, that no intermediary brokered that deal. No social media company gathered the data that was generated by that transaction so that they could better target you with ads. And no credit bureau was monitoring the transaction to better profile your credit worthiness. Now, I think that's fairly miraculous, and that is Bitcoin. It was created by an anonymous individual or group called Satoshi Nakamoto back in 2008 and launched in a paper called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system in early 2009. And it was it's only an 8-page paper and well worth a read. It's actually, in my opinion, a real work of genius, and it solved a lot of problems that were related to previous incarnations of digital cash. And specifically, it solved what became known as the double spend problem. So previously, digital cash kind of looked like email, in that if I sent you an email with a PDF attachment, that's great, you got the PDF, but I still had it. And I could send it to Linda, and I could send it to Alex, and I could send it to Ron. And you kind of don't want that to happen in a digital cash system, right? If I send you $100, you pretty much need to make sure that I don't still have the $100 to send to Linda. That's the double spend problem, and Satoshi's paper, amongst many other insights, solved that problem and created the first block of Bitcoin was mined, was added to the network in 2009, and I guess, as they say, the rest is history. Now, blockchain is one of the underlying technologies that makes Bitcoin work, and all of the other cryptocurrencies that you're probably hearing about in the news. And the reason that the blockchain is really, really important is that traditionally we have relied on large institutions to build trust into our everyday lives, into the transactions that we undertake. These are banks, credit card companies, governments, title companies, lawyers, Ron, and people here, CPAs, social media companies, and even ride-sharing companies like Uber. And to date, it's worked okay. But technology and e-commerce and globalization and simply the pace of life is moving forward very quickly. And some of these models were designed several hundred years ago, and frankly, they're beginning to fail. And we see this. We saw it in 2008, where the banks got away with basically, putting disinformation in their financial reports. We saw it before that with WorldCom and Enron, and we've seen it more recently with companies getting hacked and information getting stolen from centralized databases, and very recently with information and data being misused, and that is our data that's being misused. The Cambridge Analytica example is the one I'm referring to. So, these old school models of centralized authority that enabled trust in our society are beginning to break down. And blockchain is a foundational technology that can address those issues. It is a digital ledger that is shared across a decentralized network of independent computers, and it enables a single version of the truth to be verified, recorded, and maintained, and made available to everybody. And so we can talk a little bit more now about how, what the constituent parts of the blockchain are. I think the slides are taking a little time to catch up, but I'm going to read you a statement from the book that Alex quoted, The Truth Machine. When I get asked to describe what blockchain is, I don't think I've ever described it in the same way twice. There are so many aspects and to the blockchain that it requires complex and long explanations, but we're going to try and keep this as simple as possible. So in the book The Truth Machine by Casey and Vigner, they describe the blockchain as a distributed append-only ledger of provably signed, sequentially linked, and cryptographically secured transactions that are replicated across a network of computer nodes with ongoing updates determined by software-driven consensus. And I know that's a mouthful, so let's just break that down a little bit. So first of all, the blockchain networks are distributed. The data is not stored in one place. The nodes, the computers on the network, are independently responsible for updating in coordination with each other the ledger, each ledger, constantly updated, and it's a commonly agreed record of the truth between all of the nodes. Append only. Information can only be added to the blockchain. It cannot be deleted. No records can be tampered with, and the agreed upon truth is the truth. There is no room for debate in a blockchain. Provably signed. So blockchains use various forms of encryption, PKI, public key infrastructure encryption, to share and control the data. This technology provides public and private keys which confirm the ownership of data, currency, identity, stock, art, real estate, almost anything, and then enable the user to transact those assets securely with parties that they don't know and don't trust anywhere in the world. Each block in the chain, hence the blockchain, is sequentially linked and cryptographically secured. Blocks of data are chained together using cryptographic locks, added chronologically and time-stamped. The chain cannot be broken, and this provides provenance, in other words, the source of data, and immutability of data. And as I said before, all of the information is replicated across the network. It's not stored in a centralized honeypot, which would be attractive to hackers. Information is added to the blockchain by consensus. Miners, which are special nodes on the network, present data in blocks for adding to the network, and by consensus, the nodes agree whether those transactions are valid and should be added. and any erroneous data or invalid transactions are rejected, and so are any bad actors, anybody operating it not in the best interests of the network. And in this way, you know, corruption by any central authority is avoided. So, just waiting for the slide to catch up. So in a blockchain, it's not all about money. It's not all about Bitcoin. We've seen that the blockchain is essentially some clever code, some cryptography, consensus algorithms, a network, and some application of game theory that makes it sort of economically infeasible to cheat the system. And blockchain technology has been applied in a myriad of ways. And as such, we have a sort of a generation game. Bitcoin, if you like, was the first generation of the blockchain. We've already talked a little bit about Bitcoin. But then we have Ethereum, which many of you will no doubt have heard of, which is perhaps the second generation of the blockchain and introduces new capabilities. We're going to talk about Ethereum on the next slide. But it's worth saying that these early blockchains do suffer from some facets of their own success in a way, in that you probably hear that there are scalability issues with the Bitcoin blockchain and with Ethereum, which in turn is driving up the cost of transaction. Both of these, the core coding groups behind Ethereum and Bitcoin are working on solving these problems, and I think they will get solved, and again, we'll return to this later. But beyond these two blockchains, we have other blockchains with slightly different configurations, different protocols, different focus, different applications, and these, if you like, third generation blockchains are sort of starting from where Bitcoin and Ethereum have sort of got up to, and they're kind of negating or claiming to negate some of the problems that Bitcoin and Ethereum are suffering from. And in this group, you've got Stellar, you've got Ripple, you've got EOS, IOTA, and Neo, and many others that you may have heard about in the press. I just want to mention a contentious thing in the blockchain world, which is the idea of a network fork. Forking is when the core code of the blockchain is changed, and it's contentious because in theory you shouldn't be able to do that. It's only ever done by consensus, and it has been done a number of times, certainly on the Bitcoin network, and in fact other cryptocurrencies, for instance Litecoin, which some of you may also hold because you can buy that on Coinbase, and Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin Gold, and Zcash are forks from the Bitcoin network. Changes to the core code, either to solve a problem or improve things, or to meet a different application or requirement. And it doesn't happen often, but it is something that's worth mentioning because it's as I say, very contentious within the community. One of the things I just want to finish this slide up with is the issue of interoperability. Given that we've got a lot of blockchains out there, I think what will drive global adoption of the technology is when blockchains are able to talk to each other. And that is a very nascent technology, but there are companies out there who are working on enabling blockchains to talk to each other. One of them is a company called Polkadot. That's exactly what they're doing, but there are many others. I think that's a technology to, by the way, they've already raised 140 million. So clearly a lot of people are interested in the ability to be able to make blockchains talk to each other. And I think that's a key development that we'll see over the next few years. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Ethereum because, well, it's an interesting story for one thing, and it's a pretty amazing piece of technology. I don't think it's the be-all and end-all, and I certainly don't think it's the end game, but it's clearly interesting. Ethereum, like Bitcoin, is a distributed public blockchain, and it was created by a guy called Vitalik Buterin, who's a software developer, software programmer, and he was 19 years old when he created Ethereum, which I think was 4 or 5 years ago, and he's now pretty much blockchain royalty. When he speaks, the blockchain community listens. Ethereum is different to Bitcoin because Bitcoin is essentially designed for one purpose only, and that is financial transactions, the movement of cryptocurrency. Ethereum is different because it has an operating system called the Ethereum virtual machine, which is essentially a global decentralized computer, which includes what is known as a Turing complete software development system. And by Turing complete, I mean you can basically replicate any logic within the code that you might need to solve a problem. That brings to the fore a technology called smart contracts. Smart contracts which are neither smart nor contracts, I have to say, but that's the term which describes a self-executing autonomous program that interacts with users and devices and other smart contracts on the Ethereum network. And that takes blockchain to a whole new level beyond Bitcoin. And there's a huge developer community that's grown up about developing these decentralized applications, or dApps. There's about 1,600 dApps that are on the Ethereum network now, and about 600 are live, and everything from, you know, online identity systems, decentralized voting platforms, IoT security, trading exchanges, games, everything you can name is being developed using smart contracts on Ethereum. And this is leading us to a world where we deal in a decentralized economy, where everything is decentralized. There is no central authority that controls transactions, you know, gaming, our identity, voting. This is the direction that we appear to be moving with the blockchain. And there are other platforms which are following Ethereum, claiming to be Ethereum killers. EOS was due to be launched last weekend, but didn't actually get launched, but they claim faster transaction speeds than Ethereum and free transactions, and free is always very appealing. So we'll see what EOS brings to the table when it eventually gets launched. Just take a drink. So in the real world, what problems can blockchains solve? I'm sort of tempted to say all problems, but I won't say that. So in our world today, pretty much anything can be digitized. But what does that actually mean? A digital representation of a physical asset, like a commodity or a real estate or currency or stock or so on. And once assets like these have been digitized, they can be transacted on the blockchain. The blockchain provides proof of identity, proof of ownership, privacy, access to other parties that you might want to transact with, data and transaction records, and of course security. And so given the digitization of assets and what the blockchain brings, we now do not need intermediaries to manage transactions, to slow things down, to increase friction, and to add costs to these transactions. And it also means, interestingly, that we could potentially trade percentages of assets. You could own 1% of a money. Why not? You could sell 10% of your house to an investor group to raise money to build another level, and so on. Digitization and transaction capability leads to impact at every level of society. And I sort of listed here 3 levels, if you like. So, you know, for planet Earth, IBM, for instance, is working with a fintech company called Viridium to tokenize carbon credits, and then use those to incentivize companies to pollute less. For consumers, it's all about the ownership of personal data. We've talked about that already. Data at the moment is owned by large institutions who have a tendency to lose it on your behalf, and certainly use it in ways that you might not be comfortable with. The blockchain has the capability to put that data back in the hands of the data subject, if you like to use a GDPR term, the data owner, you and I, and allow us to control and manage our health data, our social media data, our financial data, and to monetize it if we choose to. And for enterprises, again, going back to IBM, because they're a leading light in blockchain, they're doing a number of things. They're working with Maersk to increase the efficiency of global trade in the shipping industry, and Walmart is launching, is using blockchain to recall foods that have failed some level of test, to bring recalled foods out of their supply chain more efficiently. So almost at every level, blockchain has some degree of impact, and some significant degree of impact too. Before he died, obviously, Stephen Hawking said that artificial intelligence was the biggest threat that he could envisage to mankind, and maybe he was right. I would sort of argue, not that I would ever argue with Stephen Hawking, mind you, but I would add that if you throw in the Internet of Things, where every device on the planet is connected to the internet and generating data, that can be analyzed by artificial intelligence, and which then learns from it, I think that's fairly scary. It's kind of the thing of nightmares, you know. I mean, we're almost at, you know, Skynet, for those of you who've seen Terminator, you know, a malicious group of self-learning machines that wants to take the planet over. I might argue that the blockchain could be a technology that could make all of that work more productively and more positively, because remember, blockchain only acts upon consensus. It prevents malpractice and behavior that isn't in the interest of the group. And it eliminates bad actors, or perhaps the word eliminate with relation to terminator is not the right term, but you get my point. So blockchain could be the controlling force that enables us to use AI and IoT more effectively. And certainly those three technologies are almost a perfect form of a perfect storm of technology. And so I think we're going to come to, in a second, a quote by the chief digital evangelist from Salesforce. Always fancied the idea of being a chief digital evangelist, but saying that blockchain is highly disruptive and so on and so forth. And I would agree. But specifically, I'd like to take a look at that disruption and how that actually, appears in the real world. So I've listed some industries here, if you like, and some companies that are working in those industries that are definitely out to disrupt. I'll mention a few. We haven't got a huge amount of time, but I'll mention a couple, and then I want to talk about one particular sort of potential application where which you might not have thought about. In real estate, it's a pretty obvious one for disruption. I mean, the distance between buyer and seller is a long way at the moment. There's a lot of intermediaries who are mostly pushing paper around, and an obvious area where blockchain could affect that is in the area of title searches and title insurance. So if you can imagine a situation where every transaction involving a property or some land is recorded and verified onto the blockchain, it then is immutable. So you then have provenance and immutability. There is therefore no need to do a title search because it's all there, it's all proven, and therefore you don't need title insurance. So you can see that if you run through the value chain of a real estate transaction, there are definitely areas that could be removed and replaced using blockchain technologies. In international remittances, and I used to be in this business, sending money overseas back to your home country, often developing countries, is challenging and expensive. Western Union charge about 10%. So if you're sending $200 home to a family member in Africa somewhere, then you're going to lose $20, which is a lot of money. And it goes through several financial institutions, takes several days to settle, and so on and so forth. And you actually don't know when it's been received at the other end, so you've got to call the person to check that they got it. This has never been the easiest thing to do. Now, blockchain and cryptocurrencies could change that model significantly, where you can send international remittances in a peer-to-peer model directly to the person, the recipient in the far country, without going through any intermediaries, without going through any banks, at very low cost and settled in almost real time. And most people around the world have cell phones, and it doesn't even need to be a smartphone. It can be done using an SMS text, so it could just be a cheap feature phone, a few dollars, and you could achieve remittances at a fraction of the cost that are being charged at the moment. So there's a couple. We could give many examples, but I want to talk about one in particular, and I want to just take a closer look at the market for ride-sharing services, Uber. Is a particularly interesting one, in my opinion. So Uber and other ride-sharing companies claim to be part of this new sharing economy, but in reality, they are actually just aggregators. I mean, they aggregate riders, people needing a ride, and they aggregate people prepared to share their car to give a ride, and then they connect the two together. And for that, they charge 20 to 25% of every ride, which is a significant piece of the action. They also don't share in the sense that they keep all of your data, and it's not just your favorite places or your travel history. They keep your credit card information, and they keep your home address and other information. They use it to drive up their own business. Of course they would. They drive revenues, they attract new drivers, they use your data in ways that you can't really control. And it's interesting that despite their success, they've been fairly unable to prevent various degrees of terrible behavior from their drivers and in the boardroom, I have to say. But you'd ask, well, aren't Uber part of this new economy, delivering a better experience for consumers and drivers? And I would argue not, actually. I think I would argue that Uber is ripe for disruption by blockchain, because using a blockchain, riders and any company or individual offering a transport service could be connected without any intermediary, without Uber. So imagine a situation where a user, a rider, uses a DAP to post a requirement that they need to go from A to B. And any organization who is in the network could respond to that request. And that could be a taxi driver, it could be a bicycle sharing company, it could be a rickshaw driver, it could be a mass transit company, it could be the bus company. And so as it happens, this rider is very close to a bus stop, but they didn't know. And the bus company comes back and says, your best bet is to get the number 7 bus and get to your destination, and that's the cheapest and quickest option. The bus company wins the deal. There's no Uber, there's no central authority collecting your data, there's nobody keeping your credit card information. It's all paid for in cryptocurrencies, it's all using a smart contract. And you could introduce a token, a cryptocurrency, to drive the right behaviors from drivers and riders within the community. And you could also introduce a reputation model that enables reputation scores to be applied. So you get paid a little bit more as a driver if your reputation is higher, a little bit lower if it's lower. And by the way, if it goes too low, you get thrown off the network. And maybe they want to introduce that into the boardroom. Who knows? Might be an answer to all their problems. So that's a potential scenario, and the company here, Commerce, is moving in that direction, and I'm sure there will be many others. So that's an example of how blockchain can disrupt an industry that looks like it's already been disrupted. Just some more use cases, and I'll run through one more use case just to demonstrate how blockchain is being used in a slightly different environment. There's some companies here that I've worked with already. HealthWiz, Raj Sharma at HealthWiz has launched an application which enables patients to maintain control and to monetize their own health data rather than have it sit across many providers. It's interesting that Kodak, who I didn't even know was still a viable business, are launching an ICO to, it's a technology that allows to solve some copyright problems with photographers, and they sort of jump in their share price, and they had some heightened performance, and they're working with a technology company called When Digital to raise a substantial amount of money. It'd be interesting to see whether that works out. And there are many countries around the world that are using blockchain. Estonia, Singapore, Dubai are implementing blockchain systems that allow citizens to interact seamlessly with a whole range of government services, and that's also happening in states across the US as well. But I want to talk about one particular industry and application that I've worked closely with, and it's one you probably don't think about as a potential for a blockchain solution, and that's the recruitment industry. So I've noted here a couple of companies, Springroll and Appy, and I know both of those companies very well. The major problem faced by recruitment consultants today is that they don't know whether the resume that the candidate posts is truthful or not, and that's their problem. And so if they're going to put forward candidates to an employer recommending that this is a person who would do a great job for them, they need to be absolutely sure that the candidates they put forward are telling the truth on their resume or their CVs. And so they spend an inordinate amount of time checking every resume, calling employers, checking that they ran this project or they went to this school and have this certification. And that's one of the reasons why we've all been very upset when we get the bill from recruitment consultants and it says 20% of first year salary, which has always seemed inordinately high to me, but that's the reason. And there's an awful lot of background work that goes on that consultants have to do to make sure they put forward the right candidates. And that also, of course, slows down the process, slows down the throughput of candidate through to filling an empty seat. Blockchain can help solve that problem. And the way that Springroll, Appy, and others are doing it is to enable candidates to post resume information to the blockchain and have that information verified by the school, the certification authority, the employer, or other institution. Have it absolutely verified as it goes onto the blockchain. And once there, of course, it is immutable and can be accessed by a variety of people. It doesn't need to be checked every time, and therefore you reduce the cost of confirming applicant resumes and increase the throughput. So you've reduced the cost and you've increased the speed with which you can fill empty seats and essentially flip the economics. And so there's an example of how blockchain can impact the recruitment industry. I'm being told to move on fairly quickly here because we're taking too much time. So I want to talk quickly a little bit about permissioned and permissionless blockchains. Bitcoin is the Bitcoin blockchain allows anybody anywhere in the world to access it and transact on it. It is a permissionless public blockchain, as is Ethereum. But you can understand that there would be concerns in some quarters with some enterprises, some organizations, that having no one in charge of a technology that is maybe used for financial transactions or supply chain management would be somewhat disturbing. And firstly, Ron, who do you sue if things go wrong in a public permissionless blockchain? Good question. And so there is another flavor of blockchain which is a permissioned version or private version, whereby it isn't open to everybody, and it isn't the code isn't necessarily open source that can be altered by anybody. And it's used where there already exists an amount of trust, a degree of trust between the entities, such as in a group of banks that may wish to cooperate. There is no need for everybody to have access to the blockchain platform, and there are still significant benefits of using blockchain. I would argue not as great, but there are benefits, and if necessary, code could potentially be rewritten. It can be argued that these private blockchains are not actually blockchains. They often don't use a consensus algorithm in the same way that Bitcoin and Ethereum do, and they're sort of more akin to a distributed ledger or even a database than a blockchain. But nevertheless, there's a place for them, and I'll talk a little bit about which ones might win out, but there's certainly benefits to using a blockchain over a database in specific applications. I would like to point out that that Bitcoin, the oldest and original public and permissionless blockchain in 9 years, has still not been hacked, which is not something that can be said for a lot of centralized organizations. Which one will win out? Right now, if you've got a business problem, my suggestion is use the technology that best meets that requirement and fits your culture and your risk, tolerance for risk. I would say that ultimately public permissionless blockchains will provide greater security, efficiency, and flexibility. But right now, use the technology that meets your requirements most effectively. We'll quickly talk about different flavors of cryptocurrency, only because it's confusing and there really aren't any hard lines around it. So I'm going to move through it fairly quickly. I'm going to refer back to Jay Clayton's interview on CNBC this week, but on that interview, he said that Bitcoin was the only cryptocurrency as far as he was concerned. He also said that it was likely that at some stage Bitcoin would replace fiat currency, which is interesting. So Bitcoin is definitely a cryptocurrency, and in general, other coins that have been forked off the Bitcoin network that include Litecoin, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin Gold, and others are also generically cryptocurrencies. Altcoins or alternative coins are tokens or cryptocurrencies that are based on other technologies, other blockchains that have slightly different consensus algorithms or slightly different protocols or slightly different applications or focus. These would include, Ether, IOTA, Tron, Neo, Stellar. There are many others. They don't generally have quite the utility of Bitcoin, but they certainly have aspirations to get there. Crypto tokens or tokens are a slightly different animal again, in that they're generated around a specific application, which enables the owner of the token to be able to purchase the services of the application. Their objective is to drive up usage and volume, and they can also be used to drive behavior, as we alluded to in the ride-sharing application, also the recruitment application. They also tend to be used to inhibit bad actors as well. So there are three sort of flavors. There are others, and as I said, the boundaries are somewhat blurred. Ethereum has a base token called an ERC20, which is an 80 lines of code, which defines a basic token. As a company creating a token, you can then change that. So for instance, if you wanted to add some code that said that token can't be traded for 12 months, you could code that into the token. It's essentially just a smart contract. And that's, if you hear the term ERC20, that's what it refers to. So This all leads to initial coin offerings, which are in the press a great deal. And so an ICO is a crowdfunding vehicle that allows companies to raise capital to start or develop or complete a crypto or a blockchain project, and involves offering a crypto token to sale for interested parties. It's usually done prior to development or launch. And it has got a lot of press lately because although $4.some billion of capital was raised in ICOs in 2017, a significant percentage was through scams. There's no doubt about it. A lot of the ICOs that were launched were basically vaporware. We'll come back to regulation and why that may change. So the term ICO is somewhat losing favor. I've seen token generation event and security token offering security token offering used instead. And despite this, as I understand it from my research, CoinDesk has said that $6.3 billion worth of capital has been raised in Q1 of 2018 through ICOs, so still very popular. And the issues of scamming aside, ICOs open up the opportunity to invest in new technologies and new ventures to everybody, not just VCs and high net worth individuals. Essentially, and in theory, anyone can invest in an ICO, and if you like, that could be the democratization of capital. And all of these tokens move us towards a token economy, where basically any thing of value can be tokenized and traded for another token which represents a different value. Steemit is a social media platform that is trying to replace Facebook, and it does it by rewarding content that's posted to the network and voting on whether it's legitimate or not, and it's taken down if it isn't, and maybe this is the answer to fake news. So you know, how is the issue of ICOs being addressed around the world and in the US? So around the world, regulators and governments are addressing ICOs in various ways. The problem is that an ICO is essentially a regulatory workaround. It avoids due diligence requirements, complex application procedures, and financial reporting. In China and South Korea, we've seen ICOs banned. Japan's flip-flop between one position and another. And in general, there's just a lot of confusion in most jurisdictions. Some companies are embracing ICOs, and Singapore, for instance, Switzerland, other countries are beginning to implement regulations that would encourage ICOs. In the US, it's been fairly confusing. Last week, SEC Chairman Jay Clayton was interviewed on CNBC and absolutely stated that all tokens launched through an ICO were securities. So that is a definite, well, more than a shot across the bows. Albeit the statement being made on a sort of a national news channel, not in a more formal announcement, it really does go some way to put to bed the question of whether ICOs are securities or not, ICO tokens are securities or not. And it remains to be seen how that works out. But if I was an ICO, if I'd launched an ICO in 2017 claiming that my token was a utility, I would probably be losing some sleep right now. And as I understand it, the SEC has sent out something like 80 subpoenas asking for more information from ICOs that were launched last year. The point is regulation is coming, and it will be varied by jurisdiction, but in the US you can expect it to be in line with existing securities regulations, and it's a good thing. It's going to prevent the scammers, legitimize the offerings, and allow a lot more people other than VCs and traditional investors to participate. We talked about some of the problems that Bitcoin and Ethereum have been having with scalability, as sort of a function of their own success, if you like. Just to put that into context, at the moment, Bitcoin transacts about completes about three or four transactions per second. Ethereum about 20. Uber completes about 12 rides per second, and PayPal around 200. Visa is up around the 2,000. There are technologies coming that are going to solve those problems and increase the throughput of both Bitcoin and Ethereum. And when they do, there will be a significant additional amount of disruption to come. Right now, the data flowing across the internet is essentially controlled by Google, Amazon, Facebook, and indirectly Apple. And once the data is able to be placed back in the hands of individuals rather than with those monolithic organizations, there will be another round of disruption. The higher usage, the higher availability of Bitcoin and blockchain, and Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other blockchains may well facilitate that in the future and take us from the internet of information through to the internet of value. Okay, so just very quickly, just a little bit about identity management. At the moment, to demonstrate your identity, you use a range of things: your driver's license, passport, medical ID cards, and so on and so forth. And that data is often requested by a range of organizations, your banks, insurance company, employer, Netflix, whoever. And that means that information is stored broadly across a whole range of institutions. Blockchain potentially can address this issue by creating and proving the identity of individuals and devices who are party to transactions. So you can create and maintain a verifiable, provable, immutable record not only of your identity, but of the identity of everybody that you do business with. And there are a number of companies out there working on this, and a lot of applications that we talk about in technology and other vertical industries start with identity, proving who you are on the blockchain, enabling you to transact in a trustful environment without knowing the other party. Okay, so what should you do about it? So first thing I'd like to say here is, I don't believe, and I think a lot of people don't believe, that this technology is going to get uninvented. It's not going to go away. It may get hijacked in the same way as the internet got hijacked to some degree. We certainly hope not, but time will tell. It's driven by a diverse, global, and extremely passionate community of individuals and organizations and nations. And there are opportunities for startups, early stage companies, and large enterprises for blockchain solutions. So it almost covers every industry, every market, and every location. And so what we say to people is, look, the blockchain is a train. And right now you're on the track if you don't know anything about it. It's coming towards you. It isn't going to stop. You have some options. The first is you can remain on the track, and we wouldn't recommend that. But the second is you can take a step to the side, watch the train go past, see who's on it, where it's going, and whether you are interested and should do something about it. Or you can get on the train and take the journey. And clearly options 2 and 3 will be the ones that we would recommend. So Achievion can help you determine whether blockchain is the right solution. If it isn't, if a database is the better solution, we'll tell you. We can look at customer requirements, we can look at solutions, problems you're having, and find out whether blockchain can deliver a useful solution. In terms of taking that blockchain journey, you can take a deeper dive into blockchain. We can do workshops, project definition workshops, where we work through challenges that you might have the blockchain can solve. We can run market analysis projects where we look at your particular industry to determine who's doing what your competitors are doing, and then potentially identify a blockchain project or a program, and then we can help you develop business plans, project implementation plans, and of course we can help you execute. And so that's what Achievion Solutions, Alex and I, are focused on doing.
Well, thank you. And
sorry I overran.
Oh no, that's good. We're halfway through the presentation, and now we're ready to hear from the lawyers and Marashan and Donahue, the CommLaw group. And we'll start with Linda McReynolds, who works on privacy issues here, and take it away.
Well, thank you, Peter. I think that this is a fascinating technology, and I admit I'm not a technical expert. And so explaining what blockchain is, how it works, I'm someone who thought it only related to cryptocurrency, and realized that I'm learning now that this is an application that could be used, blockchain could be used for many different applications in different industries. And as Peter said, the technology isn't going to be uninvented anymore, I think, than a lot of regulations that have taken years to rewrite. I don't think they're going to be unwritten in the short term either. So, the question that we all pose then is the technology going to change to adapt to the regulations, or are we going to rewrite regulations to make it possible for the technology to grow? And, we'll see over time, and I'll suggest some ways that, both might happen. So as Peter explained, blockchain has a number of characteristics that make it valuable in terms of privacy and data security. It is less prone to hackers. You don't have this centralized honeypot with all of the information in one place that is attractive to hackers. Rather, this is a distributed network. It's trustless in the sense that there aren't third-party intermediaries that you're relying on. And so through this consensus, you have information that has been verified by the group under rules in a way that are adopted by consensus. So you can know who's getting access to the information, and in that way, users who input information have some degree of control. But by the same token, it's append only, as he was explaining. So if you put information into the blockchain, it's there forever. You might be able to go back and say, well, I gave you, Peter, $100, and then you gave it back to me, so now I have $100. But that record of the transaction going back and forth, even though I'm made whole, that record chronologically will always be there. So if I wanted to go back and I didn't want people to know that I gave Peter $100 because it was a mistake, I can't go back and erase that. It happened, even though he gave me the money back. And so you can think about other data, not just financial transactions that may have been wrong that you would want to go back in and correct. And this information is visible to those in the blockchain. As we've discussed, as Alex had mentioned, who is responsible for compliance with data security and privacy laws in a permissionless environment where it's public, and some of the benefits of the fact that there is no centralized place where everything is kept, there's no centralized entity that's controlling everything, also may mean that there's no centralized entity who is responsible for compliance with the myriad data security and privacy laws that are out there. I'm only going to talk about a couple of these frameworks, but as we know in the US, we have a sector-specific privacy framework, so it depends on what type of data is involved, what rules apply, whether it's financial, educational information. Of course, every state has different data security and privacy laws, and we have the EU. So we'll talk about a couple of examples of how the technology and the regulations need to adapt to each other. So the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is one realm that a lot of people are talking about. So some of these benefits of the blockchain also run up against some of the rights that data subjects have to access, change, and delete their information. How can you delete information from an application where the record is immutable? Or how can you go back and correct the information when that chronological record can't be changed? You might update. And if you wanted to get a copy of all of your information, who would you ask? In a permissionless environment. Now, when you have a private permissioned blockchain, in that case, I would say you might have someone you could go to ask for that information, or someone who is responsible for giving you access and a right of access. So here, I've just mentioned a few of the GDPR requirements and how blockchain characteristics might make it difficult to comply, but not impossible. And I think most notably, we think about Article 17's right to be forgotten in this append-only environment. So how do you resolve this conflict? And again, as an attorney, I'm not giving technical advice. These are things really I've read about that our friends at Achievion might say absolutely not. For example, we've learned about the contentious nature of creating a new fork in a blockchain and having a new if you're in a permissioned environment and someone could tell everyone who's could talk to all of the nodes and say, okay, we're going to come up with a new rule because I want to hide the fact that I gave you $100 because it was a mistake and you gave it back to me anyway, no harm, no foul. Let's just erase that or change the rules or rewrite this. So it's contentious, but it is theoretically or maybe more than theoretically possible in a permissioned environment to change the blockchain. So that's one possibility. I think we should assume that, as I mentioned, the GDPR is here to stay for quite some time. There may be some changes over time, but it took a long time to arrive at the GDPR in the first place. So, you know, as mentioned before, when you are contemplating how blockchain can help you, be sure to evaluate also the data security compliance issues that we're talking about. So this is a part of the risk assessment. Identify what type of data you will be processing. So if you're processing personal data about EU data subjects, just take that inventory and do the assessment. I wouldn't say you absolutely have to rule out using a blockchain application because you are doing business in the EU. I wouldn't put a bright line rule like that, but there may be ways to take personal data, even if you can't fully anonymize in all cases, that you could treat personal data differently, keep it in a different database, use hashes. There are, you know, things to consider to work around and still benefit from using blockchain. And just one more legal framework that is of interest and perhaps in conflict with blockchain. So healthcare applications. We heard about one healthcare application and the importance of interoperability generally that blockchain is starting to resolve. So as a patient, you know, we all know just as people that it is very helpful to have a common set of information so that all of your doctors know what medications you're taking, that they can see, you know, what treatments you're getting, and all of the benefits to healthcare of having correct information that can be shared among healthcare providers that's verified and verifiable. But if your different healthcare providers use different blockchains, or one can't verify something because maybe it was a mistake, or there's, you know, there are a lot of issues about not only the highly sensitive nature of the information that's there, but how to get it to work in a way that helps healthcare institutions. So like the GDPR, HIPAA also contains rights. So there's a patient bill of rights giving patients a right of access to their healthcare information. And the same issue here, if it's a permissionless blockchain environment, to whom would they go to correct a record that's really held and shared by multiple healthcare providers? And how do you enter into business associate agreements? If you are a covered entity and it's a distributed network of information, every time you have a new patient, do you have to enter into business associates agreements with everyone who might be processing that data in some way? So these are things to understand, but I wouldn't say that means, you know, blockchain can't work in a healthcare environment. It's just, again, this assessment that you should undertake at the outset. And so that leads to, you know, again, what to do. I think before you adopt blockchain technology, get facts about the type of data you'll collect, from whom, with whom it will be shared. Just like any assessment or any privacy risk assessment, gather those facts, determine what law applies, look at your contracts, see where there may be gaps, and determine what your role will be with respect to that data.
All right, well, thank you, Linda. And we're going to have Ron talking in a minute, but before that, I wanted to go through one more issue which connects to privacy and security, which is unfair and deceptive marketing. Federal law prohibits making false promises in the marketplace. It's especially important to follow that law when working with new technologies, emerging technologies. It is very important for companies to understand what they are doing, to provide information that is clear to customers and the public, and that will happen in privacy notices in terms of service. The Federal Trade Commission and state attorneys general have the power to bring lawsuits when a company says one thing and then does something different. So as a result, it's very important to update your public statements, marketing materials, and contracts to reflect your current practices, including privacy and data security practices. We recommend regularly reviewing and auditing your company's compliance with all these different best practices. On a related note, the Federal Trade Commission requires companies to follow best practices relating to use of and security of data. So we recommend that clients follow those industry standard best practices at all times. In particular, companies are urged to build privacy into products from their conception. That's privacy by design, and not to collect too much information, but instead to practice data minimization. Ron, we're ready for you to take us through some additional legal issues.
Okay. Yeah. Hi. I'm Ron Quirk, the head of the Marashlian and Donohue's Internet of Things practice group, and I'm a little bit under the weather today. My voice isn't operating at full steam, but I will do my best to make this portion as intelligible as possible. Hopefully informative, but at least intelligible. Linda did a very thorough job of delineating privacy and data security issues, and Peter did a very good job in talking about the technology of blockchain. This portion is going to focus on some other legal matters that do or will affect blockchain going forward. We left out the major issue of securities regulation because we could have a week-long seminar on that in and of itself. So I'm going on with some of the lesser-known legal issues that do need to be paid attention to. Many of these issues, with the possible exception of smart contracts, are not typically discussed in the trade publications or blogs. But it's very important to recognize and be prepared to deal with these matters because they tend to crop up when you least expect them, and failure to be prepared could result in disruptions and ill effects on your bottom line. Excuse me. So the first issue is jurisdictional issues regarding contracts. Obviously the worldwide nature of blockchain means that nodes could be located almost anywhere. And with that being the case, a number of complex jurisdictional issues can crop up, which require careful consideration in blockchain contractual relationships. And because each transaction could potentially fall under the jurisdiction of the location of any node in the network, depending on, obviously the transaction, the parties or whatnot, there could be some unwieldy issues concerning the governing law. I mean, a lot of transactions or jurisdictions, especially internationally, have some pretty wonky tenets of contract and title, which differ across jurisdictions. So pinpointing the appropriate governing law is critical. Basically, the takeaway with this section is that in any blockchain contract, an exclusive governing law and jurisdiction clause should be absolutely inserted into the contract, and we need certainty regarding which law applies, the rights and responsibilities of each party, and the forum for handling disputes. So that's, I think, the most important issue just right off the bat as far as contractual issues involving blockchain. The next issue is service level agreements. And there needs to be, well, first of all, these are very typical in telecom and technology agreements. The contracting parties need to agree on an acceptable level of service, promptness in repairs, and compensation for downtime. Critical issue here is the willingness of vendors to commit to performance assurance. Things can get a little bit dicey in blockchain because vendors are often hesitant to commit to accepting liability for multiple customers. So vendors will often try to negotiate contracts essentially on an as-is basis with minimal, if any, service level assurance and no warranties concerning the performance of the services. That, of course, is unacceptable to many users, and users will want to negotiate service level agreements whereby an acceptable level of technology performance is guaranteed. A key contract provision with blockchain is mutual indemnification clauses. The vendor wants to be protected in the event of third-party lawsuits against the user's use or application of the technology if that violates the law. And of course, the user wants to be protected against third-party lawsuits due to the malfunction or regulatory violation of the technology. if utilized in accordance with the agreement. So also, excuse me, and this point is often ignored in vendor agreements. Users should get assurances in writing that the technology meets all the applicable laws and regulations, and that compensation is provided in the event that a regulatory agency finds that the technology violates its rules and needs to be repaired or replaced. And I will discuss that a little more in depth when we get to the hardware portion here. So service level agreements are very, very important, and vendors do not like them, but it's something that must be negotiated for blockchain agreements. So the next issue is smart contracts. And Peter alluded to these earlier, but I think some more information may be helpful. Smart contracts, many people agree, are going to be critical in the expansion of blockchain. As many in the audience likely know, and that this is the most basic level to describe it, smart contracts are basically blockchain-based agreements. And as Peter mentioned, we don't know if they're really contracts or not, but we call them agreements that are automatically executed when certain specified criteria is coded into the contract. In other words, a smart contract is an agreement between parties involved in a transaction that holds each party responsible for their role without any intermediaries. Smart contracts do allow for complex transactions that are more than simply exchanging digital tokens for a product or service. Bitcoin in general doesn't support decentralized smart contracts because it's used typically for peer-to-peer transfers of money, or monetary value, I should say. But half of the 10 largest cryptocurrencies can support smart contracts. Ethereum is one, and it's the most successful of the cryptocurrencies because Ethereum allows anyone to author a smart contract in widely used program languages and provides rules to determine how smart contracts are executed. So, that's second only to Bitcoin, I understand. So, and I understand it's also becoming more popular because they have a very set way of forming smart contracts. There are many examples of why smart contracts are critical for various types of transactions, and I'll just run through a few of them briefly. Crowdfunding, which, as Peter mentioned, includes ICOs. They're notorious for founders that fail to meet expectations, and also fraudulent founders who raise a lot of sums of money only to abscond with the proceeds. With smart contracts and blockchains, all donations would be held in an account distributed across the network, and the total amount would be released to the project owners only if they deliver as specified in the smart contracts. If the project owners don't deliver as described in the smart contract, the money would be returned to the donor. This one is interesting and may provide a socially responsible solution to low voter turnout. It's very common that U.S. Voter turnout tends to be quite low in comparison to other developed nations. But with blockchain and smart contracts, turnout could be increased as volunteers can transfer voting online, which would necessarily lead to higher turnout. And ledger-protected votes are virtually unhackable. To do so, they would need to be decoded and require more computing power than anyone possesses. And as Linda pointed out, healthcare is a huge use for blockchain. Personal health records could be encoded and stored on a blockchain with a private key that would grant access only to specific individuals. Among other things, this would enable medical research to be conducted in accordance with HIPAA. One company that I'm aware of is already using blockchain to enable medical patients to sell their information to research institutions for money. And also, receipts of surgeries could be stored on the blockchain and automatically sent to insurance companies as proof of delivery. And finally, real estate, as was brought up by Peter. Smart contracts enable direct rentals and even sales with no intermediary by paying via cryptocurrency and encoding the contract on the ledger. Everybody sees what's going on, so there can't be any funny business, and fulfillment is done quite easily. So now we come to the issue of smart contract enforcement. And the issue here is, since blockchains decentralize authority, they may not typically provision for an arbitrator to resolve disputes that may arise over smart contracts, which are executed automatically. My understanding is that there is some experimentation for automatic arbitration programs. I don't know how much they are in use, but I understand that there are some companies that are attempting to use those. Basic contractual legal issues such as capacity to contract, offer and acceptance, certainty, and consideration also need to be dealt with as to the validity of smart contracts. And as Peter mentioned, it may be a little bit of a stretch to even call these smart contracts, but if they are going to be enforceable, these are issues that have to be dealt with. So bottom line is that rules and regulations will likely be implemented concerning smart contracts, but until then, customers should be sure to include a dispute provision to reduce uncertainty and provide for recourse in the event of a smart contract dispute. And now to change the topic rather rapidly, we have the liability for technology malfunction and who is liable for that. This area is still in the early phases, and it's an open issue that may be decided on a case-by-case basis. Many questions remain. There's more questions than answers at this point, but there are issues that need to be addressed in blockchain agreements. Some of these include how to apportion risk if trades are not settled or settled inappropriately because of a systemic failure. If a technology failure causes exposure of confidential information, who is responsible? And if in a permissionless blockchain, who controls and stops the blockchain from working if somehow there are some malfunctions, and who is responsible for the fixes that might require some downtime? In any event, the allocation of risk and liability regarding a possibly malfunctioning blockchain system must be thought out carefully by all the relevant participants, in particular by the parties to transaction and smart contracts. They are affected by the rules that will eventually be implemented. This next part, blockchain hardware authorization and marketing rules, this has gotten virtually no coverage at all, but there are a lot of issues that could come up regarding the marketing, importation, and use of hardware such as Bitcoin miners. And I don't know if people out there are aware of this, but the FCC may be trying to balance the budget on the backs of radio frequency equipment suppliers. It's only a slight exaggeration, but it is no exaggeration that during the past couple of years, the FCC has been brutal on RF equipment rule violators. The FCC equipment rules regarding blockchain hardware are often overlooked to the peril of the company and user who ignores them. For example, in April, the FCC commenced prosecution of a Brooklyn man for operating a Bitcoin miner that purportedly interfered with T-Mobile's LTE network. This case could result in fines of several $100,000 levied on the operator and the manufacturer. As we'll get to in a moment, the manufacturer is often the responsible party. But the crux of this particular case is that the miner at issue had a miner configuration advanced setting which easily allowed the operator to change the device's operating frequency from its default setting of 350 megahertz. And that kind of easy changing of frequencies is generally prohibited under the FCC's rules unless it is confined to authorized frequencies. And this particular miner went to 700 megahertz, and T-Mobile filed a complaint, and now there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be responsible for this. So main takeaway on this is that it's really important to make sure that your hardware is in compliance with FCC rules, because if you get caught in the crosshairs of an FCC enforcement action, your company can be harmed in many ways. For example, outside of the very beginnings of these investigations, the information is made public. It said this company A has purportedly violated this rule, and this rule. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to impose fines on them and other sanctions. Substantial fines they're going up. I've noticed in recent months that the FCC seems to be breaking new ground as far as imposing monetary sanctions on offending companies. And that can often be the least of it, though. Companies can, under the rules, can be forced to stop selling non-compliant devices and take them all off the market. And there was a case back in 2008 where the FCC threatened to have this telemetry company basically dig up all their underground meters and fix them and put them back in the ground. That one got resolved by a consent decree, but that was pretty scary for that company. That would have completely put them out of business. And the other issue, the main issue here, is that the FCC lately, with these enforcement actions, has been threatening to actually revoke companies' equipment certifications, in effect banning them from the U.S. market. I personally think they're on very shaky legal ground doing that, because those rules typically apply to wireless licensees or broadcast licensees, but the FCC has decided unilaterally to apply those rules to equipment manufacturers. So takeaway here is very important to know and comply with the FCC's rules. First of all, understand what classification your equipment falls under. If it has a transmitter in it, it's an intentional radiator. If it doesn't have a transmitter in it, but it generates RF energy, it's typically an unintentional radiator. The authorization requirements between the two categories, and there are various subcategories, which I'm not going to go into here because that could take an extra hour. But intentional radiators must be tested for compliance with FCC technical rules, and then submitted to a telecommunications certification body, which is sort of a quasi branch of the FCC. The FCC approves them and whatnot. They're certified, and then the information is made public. Intentional radiators may not be sold or until they are certified. Unintentional radiators must also be tested for certification with the FCC's rules, but instead of a submission to a TCB for certification, these devices are self-authorized through the supplier's declaration of conformity process. And if you want more information on this, we here at Rasheen & Donahue, we do have a guide to FCC rules and international rules for RF equipment authorization and marketing. Labeling rules: all RF devices sold in the U.S. must be labeled in accordance with FCC rules, and you would be very surprised at how many people get tripped up on the labeling rules. The FCC will log on to a website, and they will see a device pictured, and they will notice that the labeling doesn't look right, or the device doesn't look like it's labeled. So all of a sudden you have an investigation, which often turns up many other issues, unfortunately. Advertising: all advertisements, including website advertisements of RF devices, must comply with the rules, including, as I just mentioned, labeling. And if you're going to advertise your product on a website, you better make sure that the specs are in there and that they are operating on authorized frequencies, and you're not into government frequencies or frequencies which you should not be operating on, which is what got caught, the bit miner got caught at. That was not an advertising, that was just the FCC snooping around after T-Mobile blew the whistle on them, but that is a major issue. We had a lot of talk before about responsible parties in various capacities in blockchain. For FCC equipment rules, the manufacturer is typically the responsible party, or if it's imported devices, the importer is. But sometimes vendors can be found liable for FCC infractions for For example, if they're selling products that they know are not in compliance, they can be called on the carpet. And this is important to note too for anybody that might work with refurbishers. Entities that substantially modify or refurbish devices becomes the responsible party for those devices that are modified or refurbished. So big picture is that takes a lot of due diligence. Peter had mentioned this earlier. Linda had alluded to it. But for companies investing in blockchain startups, legal due diligence is well, it's basically required, but at the very least desirable, especially as the rapid deployment of blockchain accelerates. And one issue which we didn't address too much are property rights and the information contained on the blockchain. Compilations of data may be protected by IP rights, and where database of personal information is sold, if the buyer wants to use the personal information for a new purpose, the Data Protection Act kicks in, and the buyer will need to get consent from the individuals concerned. And Linda had brought up certain issues that were close to that. So there's issues of who owns the data residing on the decentralized ledgers, if anybody, and IP ownership of blockchain as a service offerings. So that is very, very important to understand going forward. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ron. The CommLaw Group provides a wide range of services to companies seeking to roll out new or emerging technologies. We can assist with contract review, privacy or data security audits or impact assessments, regulatory compliance, and a host of other matters. We specialize in laws relating to the communications industry and also have experience in general business law and technology law. So we welcome your questions that you can send to us at the contact information on your screen. You can also, of course, contact Achievian Solutions for more information on what they do with regard to blockchain. We do have one question, and that is for Peter. Peter, what are the weakest links? Where is blockchain susceptible to human error at the device or the user who uploads the data?
Okay, so what are the weakest links? As I mentioned earlier, the Bitcoin core network itself has never been hacked. However, the software devices that give you access to the network, like the wallets and the trading exchanges, have been hacked, and some of those hacks have been very high profile. Another example is in the early days of Ethereum, there was an application called the Distributed Autonomous Organization app, the DAO. This was a DAO is a generic term for an organization that runs entirely on smart contracts. But the DAO app was a specific application for funding startups and for allowing startups to pitch and get voted on and acquire capital. It raised $150 million as an early ICO. And then almost immediately, $70 million of that money was stolen or redirected by a hacker who found a weakness in the smart contract code. So it's important to recognize that that wasn't a flaw in the Ethereum core code. It was a weakness in the smart contract, a backdoor. It actually led to it's a longer discussion than we've got time for, really, but it led to Ethereum forking their network, which is why we have Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. It was a big deal, and it created a big round of discussions and arguments within the core the coding group. But the point was that it was actually the smart contract that caused the problem, and we see that a lot, in the hardware and the software that sits around the blockchain as being the weak links. Second part of the question is, where is the blockchain susceptible to human error? Well, you take the recruitment example that I quoted earlier. You post your resume information to the blockchain, and it is therefore verified. It is then verified by the institutions that have insight into whether that data is valid. If you post information that isn't valid, it gets rejected. So in theory, all data posted, provided that the applications are written correctly and the systems are operating correctly. If you post erroneous information to the blockchain, it should be rejected. Having said that, Linda made the point, once you post information onto the blockchain, it is immutable and cannot be removed. Now, I would say with relation to GDPR, one potential solution for that, it depends on your definition of what erase is, but if erase means I can't get access to it, you could delete the private and public keys which link to that information related to the data subject, and therefore they would be inaccessible. No one would be able to break in that because nobody's broken the SHA-256 algorithm. Setting aside the fact that quantum computing might ruin my argument when that comes along, that may be one a possibility to overcome human error just by simply making the data inaccessible.
Well, thanks, Peter. I think we've run out of time. Thank you for all the participants who attended today. We look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thanks very much and have a good rest of your day.